Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 10th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. First topic, Graham Platner. Platner is the Democratic nominee for Senate in Maine, or at least he was up until a few hours ago as we record this. He officially tendered his letter to I believe the Maine Secretary of State, officially withdrawing his name from the ballot. We'll get back later to the contents of that letter that he wrote because it's worth discussing. But first, a little background on Platner. He is 41 years old. He is a Marine combat veteran who served 4 tours of combat duty in Iraq and Afghanistan before eventually returning to Maine, where he ran an oyster farm and had never held or sought public office. He was recruited into politics not by the party apparatus, but by 2 outside activists with connections to Bernie Sanders' 2 presidential campaigns. Platner is or was what has become increasingly rare in American politics, at least men running as Democrats. He is heterosexual, masculine, gruff. He's certainly working class coded, unlike people like J.D. Vance or Pete Buttigieg. He actually served in combat roles in multiple tours in the military. He famously said that if a man broke into his house, he would subdue the man and forcibly rape the man to show his dominance. There have been several Reddit posts that have been uncovered where Platner essentially lays blame on women who are sexually assaulted or raped for putting themselves in those situations by being around men who are intoxicated. And so when his narrative is that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and with alcoholism, I think it's believable and probably is due directly to serving 4 combat tours in the Middle East. In addition to the direct horrors I'm sure he witnessed and participated in, compounded with the realization that he seems to have had that it was all for naught, and that not only was his mission not successful, it was actually counterproductive and made the world a much worse place and furthered in his view, the evil aims of the American empire. It's, again, believable to think that he would have severe psychological issues after returning in around 2011. So the campaign presented Graham Platner's life as essentially a kind of redemption narrative. He was broken by war, and then he was restored by returning home to Maine and marrying a woman named Amy Gertner. Perhaps the first chink in that armor, that carefully constructed narrative that Graham Platner was attempting to construct, was the revelation that for about 2 decades he had a skull and crossbones designed tattoo resembling a Nazi Totenkopf symbol. And that was revealed to the public mid-campaign. There's been conflicting stories about his knowledge of that tattoo, why he got it in the first place, whether he knew it was associated with Nazis at all. He says that he only became aware of its association with Nazis much later. There are some people who have said he talked about knowing that it was associated with Nazis years ago, but that was sort of the first red flag for a lot of people.
Yes, Democratic primary voters in Maine who also, when they learned about the association, the leading edge of the most powerful military wing in Ukraine, the Azov Battalion, promptly dropped their support for continual American funding of the Ukrainian effort against Russia. And if it's not obvious from the delivery, that is the first of much sarcasm and incredulity that I will be dispensing. I will try to keep it in check the best I can, but there is, as we will lay out as we go through this in more detail, there is so much here in this story and the fallout from it that really gets my goat.
And Platner only got married, I want to say, a couple years ago, and even after he was married, and again, we're talking just in the last few years, he was sending sexually explicit text messages to other women while he was married. And then early, I believe, prior to him winning the Democratic primary in Maine, there was an account from a former girlfriend, Lindsay Fifield, describing his behavior as reckless and unsettling. But this did not end the campaign. But that changed just earlier this week when a second and more serious allegation was reported by Politico. This contained accusations by a woman named Jenny Racicot. She claimed that Platner forced himself on her in 2021. Platner responded to these accusations, calling them categorically untrue. I don't know what the adjective categorically means here. So the same week that this week that the Politico story dropped, this woman Racicot also did an interview with Jake Tapper of CNN. And I'm going to play a clip in a minute, but first just to summarize what the allegation she's making, the way she describes it as in 2021, shortly before that, she had matched with Graham Platner on Bumble. They had started what she calls a situationship, I guess just a casual non-exclusive relationship where they would hang out and have sex semi-regularly. And so one evening in 2021, Graham Platner was intoxicated. He was at his house, she was at hers, and they were texting back and forth. She says that he wanted to come over, and she said, no, do not come over. He came over anyway. It's a safe part of rural Maine, so she had habitually kept her door unlocked. So he just walked in. She was on the couch. He came in and forcibly touched her, and she kept saying stop. And then it moved. He kept getting physical. She kept saying stop. They ended up in her bedroom, and then they had sex, and he collapsed, fell asleep, and then she didn't want to wake him up or call the police. She says that she felt it was just safer just to wait till the morning, and she also didn't want him to drive drunk. And so then the next morning she asked him, do you remember what happened? He said, no, I don't remember. And she was angry and she told him to leave. And then she, I don't understand this detail. She said she waited a couple weeks to make sure she wasn't pregnant. And then she contacted him and basically said, I never want to talk with you again. Leave me alone forever. And she had not had contact with him ever since. There's one detail this is maybe a bit of a meta media detail that came out later. Apparently, in the midst of their texting before he came over that evening, she had texted him at one point that she wanted him to massage her glutes. And it's interesting that detail was not left out. It's not necessarily dispositive, but if you're attempting to give a broad, fair picture of the situation, seems like that would be a detail you'd want to include. So with all that set up, I'm going to play part of the interview that she did with Jake Tapper on CNN. This was just earlier this week.
Obviously been very difficult for you to talk about for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And even when you're telling the story, you don't use the word. Yeah. So let me just be, and I apologize, let me be as direct as I can. Did Graham Platner rape you?
By definition, yes. Absolutely.
Because he had non-consensual sex with you.
Yeah.
Forced himself on you.
Mm-hmm.
Even after you had told him no and fought him off.
Yeah. He violated multiple layers of consent that night by coming into my home when I asked him not to, and by advancing on me when I told him not to. And furthermore, another incident that I had told him not to do. And
with protection.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. By the way that my nervous system reacted to this experience, absolutely.
There are going to be Democrats who say, I believe you, but I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote for him anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need a progressive voice in the United States Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to be okay with that? Are you going to be able to handle that? I'm not saying it's the right answer or the right response. But
no, I have friends who feel that way. And that's been a hard pill to swallow. And I guess I need to not ask, potentially. Maybe I need to not ask in order to not care what they do. I understand. I understand that the state of our political environment is so much so that we need a lot of change. And he's offering that change. And, I'm not mad at anyone who has voted for him all along. If he wasn't who he was, I would be voting for him as well. And going forward, I don't know what's going to happen.
There's something you said that I just want to find out more about.
Mm-hmm.
You say he was forcing himself on you. It was getting violent. You were pushing him off. You were kicking him off. Needles and sewing equipment was falling all over. And walk us through the process where you decided that the safest thing you could do was just let him rape you.
Yeah, I had never been in that situation before. And I remember it being an instant where I had recognized that he wasn't listening to me. It wasn't just that he wasn't hearing me or whatnot. And then I recognized his level of intoxication, and I knew I was safe. And I don't think I was safe to physically fight back. He's big, he's strong. And I just had to evaluate my safety and come up with the least worst outcome to the situation. And so I felt like complying for my safety was the least worst option.
But that's not consenting.
No, complying is not consenting.
Complying is letting him rape you.
Is getting it over with.
So that he didn't hurt you even more?
I don't know what this person is capable of. I don't think anybody does. And even people for years and trust, you don't know the depths of what they're capable of. And
you were afraid for your safety.
Yeah, I was afraid for my safety.
Beyond, not that rape isn't a horrific thing, but beyond
rape.
I
didn't want to find out how unsafe I could get that night, or how harmed I could be that night.
I know this is probably one of the toughest things you've had to do in your life, so I just want to thank you for trusting us and sitting down with us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you guys being here to do this and to help share these stories very kindly and delicately.
Again, Graham Platner categorically denies any allegations of sexual assault. His campaign says, quote, "These allegations are very serious," and Graham vigorously denies them. They are also coached and coordinated by out-of-state establishment operatives. For a year, opponents of this campaign have thrown everything they can at Graham, calling him a Nazi, a war criminal, and a communist. None of it has been true, and this is no different. It is not a coincidence that this story comes a week before the ballot deadline, just as the previous false allegations came a week before the primary. Graham began this campaign to fight for a Maine where everyone is treated with dignity and where Mainers are put first, and no amount of desperate smears will stop this movement from seeing that vision through.
Before Jeff gets into more substantive analysis of the legal questions and the reporting that was made and the responses that were offered by the Platner campaign, a couple of things to swing back around to for those who are not particularly familiar with all aspects of human anatomy. The glutes are the butt cheek, so effectively what she was asking him to do was come over and rub her ass. As far as the multiple layers that he had to get through to get to her, having only the benefit of audio and no visual, take that to potentially mean very literally he had to go through several layers of subcutaneous fat to get into her. And I don't say this entirely to be sensationalist, although I do say it in part for that reason, but also because there is an important sexual dynamic on display here. What Jeff was describing their relationship as, the sort of friends with benefits, or where he was able to effectively hook up with her on a regular basis without having to offer any long-term commitment. In the sexual marketplace, a good heuristic to understand what men and women are after and how they differ, it's that men are seeking sex and are willing to trade commitment for that, and women are seeking commitment and are willing to trade sex for that. And so understanding that, it comes as little surprise that generally in relationships where there is a man who is in a platonic relationship with a woman who is committed to her, but in an exclusive fashion, but receives no sexual access, that the dynamic is very obvious from the outside and virtually always true internally as well, that the man has very low status and the woman holds the whip hand in that relationship. And conversely, when a man is able to have sex without any strings attached, without any commitment at any time that he wants, it's an indication that his status in the sexual marketplace is a lot higher than hers. And so that's why I bring up her unattractive appearance, because I don't think it's certainly not just something that is coincidental or not related to the broader story. And she noted in the conversation with Jake Tapper that there are a lot of problems with society, and the existence of this sort of relationship dynamic is one of those problems. And as far as her story goes, if she's so terrified about what this guy could potentially do to her if she was to resist in any way, well, what she did subsequently, allegedly, was after a few weeks cut off contact with him completely, but not take any of the evidence or any of her accusations to law enforcement or even to social media to warn other women of a predator on the loose who could potentially do things that she couldn't even imagine at the time to her. To the contrary, as Jeff will get to, there is evidence that other women that she knew asked her about Platner, and she gave him a generally positive review, said that he can get weird when it comes to consensual things, that indicating that he might be kind of sexually pushy, but she didn't at all. If she really was terrified for her life, the advice that she gave to other women that she knew who are interested in him definitely does not seem to substantiate that assessment that she's offering now 5 years after the fact.
She seems to be drawing a line between consent and compliance. And so from what I could gather in her mind and her, I'm sure, third wave feminist framework with which she views the world, a woman could comply with sexual activity but not consent. And so she was complying by stopping resisting physically, and a man could perhaps reasonably or not interpret that as consent. If a man like Graham Platner, who's probably forward, I say a Chad, he would be used to being pushy and finding that women find that attractive, and he's probably had a lot of success. If success is described as having sex with a lot of women and ideally a lot of attractive women, he presumably has a pretty good track record, and he's probably been in a lot of situations where on the surface, superficially, the woman is not exactly giving obvious consent, but it is clear from all the circumstances that it's more like kind of a 50 Shades of Grey situation where she wants to put up the illusion that she's like resisting it, but she's so attractive that the man can't resist her. And it's a whole sexual dynamic that's pretty common. And so he's probably used to that. And so, but then Jenny Racicot is putting this other layer of complication where a woman could be on the surface complying, but not giving consent. And that, as Ness will probably go into later, that hands a lot of power to women to lead to situations like this where she didn't take any sort of action really to protect women from a rapist he's still walking around. And in fact, I believe the statute of limitations for rape or sexual assault in Maine is 20 years. This happened in 2021. So presumably she could still file a police report and they could still bring a criminal prosecution. And she seems to, from what I can tell, thinks that this activity could be replicated. It's not like he's reformed his ways. And so potentially women have been for at least 5 years and still are at risk of sexual assault and rape. So it seems like she has some responsibility to do what she can to prevent this from happening. Maybe she feels like she finally did what she needed to do and she kind of has fulfilled her obligation to warn women explicitly to stay away from this guy.
More than 5 years after the fact, I wonder, too, did she make any effort to privately reach out to him or his campaign to give them a heads up that this would be coming if he didn't withdraw or if he didn't address it?
There was a New York Times article 2 or 3 months before the primary. The primary was in June 2026. So this story would have been published, I'm guessing, around April or May. And that detailed some of the allegations against Graham Platner. And part of that story, although it wasn't the focus of the New York Times story, included Racicot's description of events of that evening in 2021. And so in the course of that story, Racicot was contacted by the New York Times and shared off the record that Platner had assaulted her. She told the Times that she had some positive memories of her relationship with Platner, but thought he did not respect women and had cut off contact with him after an incident in 2021 when Platner had come over drunk. But the Times article stated that Racicot, quote, declined to elaborate, end quote, about what happened, only describing his behavior as, quote, reckless and, quote, unsettling.
Wild that he wouldn't respect a relationship with someone who offers free booty calls whenever he is interested or potentially interested without any commitments to go along with it. The world's oldest profession historically was one that women got paid for, but when she's just offering it for free, it's not a big stretch as to why he might not have been someone or may not have conducted himself in a way around her that she would interpret as the chivalrous utmost respect offered to women.
So again, we're recording this on the evening of July 10th. And this Politico story dropped earlier this week. I believe it was published on either Sunday or Monday. And then I think the CNN interview was Monday. And Graham's Platner's campaign has completely collapsed since then. Almost immediately when that Politico story was published, the Senate Democratic leadership said flatly that the party, quote, will not invest in the Maine Senate race if Platner remains on the ballot. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ro Khanna, Ruben Gallego. If you're unfamiliar with those names I just read out, those are all Democrats, 3 senators, and 1 representative. So they all withdrew their support in quick succession. And then Platner ended his campaign on July 8th, and he put out a video, which I'm going to play a part of.
Hey everyone, it's Graham Platner here. I think as many of you know, over the past couple days, I have faced some very serious allegations, and I just want to make it clear, this is all false. The things that have been claimed did not happen. It's not real. It has placed an immense amount of weight on me as I think about what needs to happen now. It's not the false allegations, though, that have brought us to where we are. It's the fact that they are being used by the political establishment to put structural pressure on us. We live in a political system that is not built for normal people. It is a system that is built structurally to make sure that movements like ours cannot flourish. That if they begin to succeed, they can be crushed. We went toe-to-toe with one of the most entrenched political systems in the history of the world, and we won. We beat them on June 9th in overwhelming numbers. We did it the right way. We built a campaign. We engaged in electoral politics. We motivated people. We banded together. We did it the way that we were told we are supposed to make change. And we won. And now they are not going to let us have it. Not if it's me. And so we're suspending campaign operations.
That would be quite the inspiring rally cry, the beginning of that YouTube video that Platner offered if he were defiantly going to stay in the race and take the fight to the political establishment that he is identifying as crushing movements like his. But instead, what he's doing is he is creating yet another illustration of how effective that establishment can be in continuing to control the political process when upstarts roll over for them without any real reason for doing so. The betting markets have had the Senate race in Maine projected to go to Democrats prior to Platner winning the primary, after he won the primary, but before he dropped out, and now also after he has dropped out, before the candidate for the Democrats has even been made public. Democrats are favored by a more than 2-1 margin. And so even in the immediate term, it looks like Platner dropping out is not going to cost this establishment that he's railing against anything. They are going to allow him to do the things that he did to win the primary and then dispatch him here and then sail off to victory. If the smart money is to be believed, the Democratic Party will gain a victory in Maine as the betting market suspected they would if Platner stayed in or if he dropped out. I'd been uncharitable to the accuser who went on CNN and the New York Times to broadcast the allegations against him 5 years after they happened that were so difficult for her to talk about. But there aren't really any heroes in this story here because Platner, this politically self-made upstart, voice of the people, tribune of the people, who is going to take the fight to the sclerotic establishment, and yet when allegations that he categorically denies and says that they are absolutely false, so he is being slandered here, and yet he's allowing that slander to totally derail the campaign and allow the establishment to assassinate his political campaign so that they can slot in some person that they are more comfortable with. I don't mean to criticize him for being broken by this process. 1/1000th of this sort of pressure would probably break me. But in this situation, he's put himself out there, and the message that he still seems to, at least rhetorically, defiantly continue to make is that the establishment is corrupt here and is taking out any populist energy, but he has to yield to the establishment because, well, that's the crux of the matter. Because why? Because allowing a genuine populist movement with, in his assessment, given that he won something like 75% of the primary vote, that this genuine populist movement that he is leading in Maine, that sacrificing it is worth it to ensure that some bug man or bug woman with a D next to his or her name replaces some husk of a woman, Susan Collins, who has an R next to her name, but they will vote the same. The Maine Senate vote will probably be not much different when it comes to questions of foreign policy.
I would maybe quibble a bit because, for instance, Susan Collins did vote for Brett Kavanaugh, and a Democrat would not have. And I think he only won by maybe like one vote. He only got confirmed by one vote. So I think it's maybe there is a difference between Susan Collins and the Democrat who might get elected.
Yeah, so I guess something as important as a Supreme Court position, but when it comes to the genocide of our time, the person who's going to replace Susan Collins will probably vote exactly the same way that she does, and that's a little bit of a presaging of what my meta-analysis is going to be, because I think that is ultimately where this is all coming from. And so, again, he is without a fight, despite the fact that he has been successful against the odds, against what the rules of the political establishment would have said he would never have said he would have been able to get this far. And he's defied those odds. But now, because the odds, again, allegedly say that he has no chance of winning if he is to stay in, even though the betting markets continuously said that the Democrat was going to win the Senate seat even after the allegations came out, and Platner was defiantly refusing in the first few days to drop out. Even then, by a 2-1 margin, the betting markets said that the Democrat was going to win the seat. Now, maybe you could argue that the smart money already knew that the writing was on the wall and he was going to drop out. Maybe that's the case. But in any event, there was no hard and fast rule that said he had to yield to the establishment to ensure, in his rendering, I guess, that an establishmentarian with a D next to his name won instead of a very moderate establishmentarian with an R next to her name. And that's worth sacrificing this populist movement and providing another victorious scalp for that establishment to hold up to show potential future challengers, potential future Graham Platner is that none of this is worth it because you will be easily snuffed out. And of course, if you were to fight on and lose, then that would be great evidence of the claims that he was making about how the system is always able to successfully break these populist movements, because the smart money and the polling showed, and the Democratic primary process showed, that he was slated to win, and it was only because of the establishment turning on him and the corporate media turning on him that he ended up losing. So that would have been a great proof of concept of the assertion that he made, but instead he says that there is no way to beat the establishment, and then refuses to actually take the fight to the establishment, setting up a situation where it looks like the reading of this is that it was a fait accompli. Whenever the establishment wants to take you out, they're going to take you out. And if you want someone who's going to be a champion, who's going to go to the mat and fight to the end for that populist movement that you support, well, even someone like Graham Platner is not going to fight on. And so you probably shouldn't waste your time fighting either.
I tend to take things at face value. And in this case, I'm not convinced that there was an elaborate conspiracy by the establishment to cut out the legs from underneath Graham Platner. He had at least many elements of the establishment behind him, such as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Ro Khanna. They're not in any significant way challenging the status quo. I suppose you could say Bernie Sanders came the closest, and to be fair, the establishment did sabotage his campaign pretty explicitly in 2016 when the Democratic machine was operating behind the scenes and rigging the process against him. I suppose in some ways Bernie Sanders acted in a similar way to Graham Platner in terms of rolling over and obeying the establishment. The Believe All Women movement arguably peaked in 2017, 2018, 2019. I think it has died down a bit. There are certain situations, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but that men get involved in varying levels of sexual scandal where in 2017, 18, 19, they would have been done for, and now they're able to withstand it. Even so, when even a somewhat credible allegation of rape or sexual assault is made against a Democrat, they're pretty much toast. And that's what seems to have happened here.
I think the pronouncements of the death of Me Too are premature, and I think that's a perfect jumping off point to a more meta-analysis I'd like to offer here. I think the thing that I alluded to previously that changed recently, that caused the establishment to turn against Platner, to make use of this allegation that, as Jeff mentioned, had already been floating around in the open for a few months, but only now it was driven home with such ferocity that it was able to destroy Platner's campaign. And I think that is the result of other primaries, in particular with regards to the question of American support for Israel in the Middle East, and the Democratic Party, the congressional members who won in New York City and then in Denver that we talked about the last few weeks, that the perspective of the establishment is that this anti-Israel, anti-Zionist sentiment in congressional races, and then in November or in January of 2027, then in Congress, that there is too much of this going on, and it is time to crack a skull of someone who is very vocally outspoken against Israel's actions in the Middle East and America's support for them. Prior to those upset victories for very anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian candidates in New York and Denver and elsewhere, that prior to those, a Platner victory in Maine would seem more tolerable, that he would be able to be gelded and put in line just like Bernie Sanders was. And prior to those other primaries, the Israel lobby had a very nice scalp to show in Thomas Massey's defeat in Kentucky. And so allowing a few voices here and there to win on anti-Israel platforms are okay, as long as it doesn't feel like there could be that it could be indicative of a real sea change in Congress. But the Israel lobby needed to show, in the wake of those House defeats, that going against the establishment on the question of Israel, which is something that Platner made a very primary focus of his campaign to end what he repeatedly called the genocide in Gaza. And the reason I tie this into the remark that the Me Too movement's death may be premature to call, or that its peak may be premature to call, is because the weakening of that Me Too energy and political correctness and cancel culture and doxing, the effectiveness of doxing and all of that has transpired over the last few years has, you'll notice, if you think about it, very, very coincidentally, has corresponded quite remarkably well with Israel's response to the Palestinian question after October 7th. When Israel turned the guns and the bombs on the Palestinians, that is when, metaphorically, the bombs and guns were turned on the power and effectiveness of political correctness in America. And it is, by extension, in this reading of the situation, that the need to turn up the heat in Gaza is what has simultaneously kept a lot of the excesses, or what we would view as excesses or totalitarian nature of political correctness and cancel culture and Me Too and doxing and all of those things that are wrapped up together, that the need for ethnic cleansing in Gaza, in Palestine, that to help make that possible, the kibosh had to be put on these Me Too style movements. And so if the ability to mainstream the accusations that what Israel is doing, what America is facilitating, and what the entire establishment has been facilitating and allowing to happen, if that is a genocide and that perspective is able to gain currency, then I think that will correspond with a resurgence in the power and effectiveness of politically correct totalitarian policing of speech and the aggressive orientation that the establishment had for Heritage America at the beginning of the Biden administration.
Let me try to summarize your thesis here. So let's start in 2017 with the rise of the Me Too movement. You're characterizing that as an inter-elite struggle. So one faction of the elites weaponizing feminism in the form of Me Too to gain power over a rival faction within the elite. And then fast forward to 2023, when the genocide in Gaza begins, that Israel carries out the genocide in Gaza. And then that genocide necessitates a thawing or a loosening of political correctness, and specifically things like transgenderism, things like Me Too. Those things are loosened up. You can be a little more misogynistic. You can be a little more anti-trans, and that's acceptable. Your life's not necessarily going to be ruined like it would have in 2017. Okay, but then I'm struggling to see the connection. Why would continuing to be, for the establishment, the Zionist power structure, for them to be able to continue carrying out the genocide, they also need to loosen up and let people be more misogynistic and transphobic?
Well, I would characterize what happened in 2017, 2018, 2019 with the Me Too movement not as two factions of elites fighting, but a jockeying of positions among elites without a change to the underlying structure, the underlying cultural and political structure of the establishment. In contrast, I think what Israel has done in Gaza, in Palestine since 2023 does present a fundamental change in the way that the establishment orients itself in terms of the actions that it takes internationally and domestically. And to continue to maintain the support to do the things that Israel and America supporting Israel has done with the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. It was perceived to be useful to restrict. I mean, I'm adding more agency than could be warranted, of course, because this is speculation, but there are incentives and pressures behind the scenes that I couldn't pretend to have the first grasp of understanding where those things are coming from. I'm just trying through a glass darkly understand based on the ramifications, and I want to draw a parallel to what is widely understood to be a thawing of political correctness in the early to mid 90s that corresponds in many ways to the thawing in political correctness that seems to have happened since about 2023 to the present. In the early 90s, C-SPAN carried American Renaissance conferences live. A mainstream publisher carried Jared Taylor's book. Charles Murray went on major news broadcasts to talk about and defend the bell curve.
And just to clarify, American Renaissance, Jared Taylor, those are white nationalists. And then Charles Murray, most famous for talking about the connection between biological race and IQ.
Well, to defend Charles, yeah, that's probably what he is most famous for. Yeah, well said. That wasn't his primary emphasis, but that was definitely what drew the most attention. That's what people were most interested in. But there was that.
Well, that's why you're bringing it up in the context of the 90s on saying because somebody like him could talk about controversial topics such as the connection between race and IQ.
Yes, in particular race and IQ, but even just inborn inherent intelligence and what it determines in terms of life outcomes. But yeah, the broader point is well taken, that there was a thawing out of the ability to talk about these sorts of things, and thinking through it, when that ended corresponded when the openness ended and political correctness as it came to be known in the 90s and the 2000s, that corresponded with the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, of which Israel was a big supporter to the end. And it was really the withdrawing of Israel's support and America's support that caused the apartheid regime to collapse. And I think there could be a similar dynamic playing out here, where the collapse or the impending collapse of the Israel apartheid regime will presage an ending of that falling out period for political correctness, and will set up a return with a vengeance of the same energy that animated Me Too and cancel culture and all of the other political correct consequences that we had become accustomed to in the 2000s and the 2010s and up until the beginning of the 2020s, until Trump's seemingly surprising second election in 2024, and a lot of the Silicon Valley elite support that had up until the October 7th attacks in Israel, up until that point, had been pretty uniformly opposed to Trump and the anti-political correctness campaign that he effectively served as an avatar of, and moved over in support of him. And I think in the same way that the establishment of the time in the late 80s and early 90s was trying to support apartheid South Africa, and then at some point determined that it was no longer a viable option, that something similar could be happening here with American and Israel support for the Zionist project in the Middle East. And when that collapses, I think that it will again bring or herald a return of political correctness and the consequences of it that will make the Me Too movement of the mid and late 2010s, let alone the political correctness of the late 90s, look like child's play.
Let's say I'm an elite whose top priority is continuing the genocide or ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Why then am I also wanting to loosen or thaw political correctness? Why do I, if I want to continue ethnically cleansing Palestinians, why do I also need to necessarily allow Americans to be more transphobic or more misogynistic?
Because all of these things are bundled together. All of the energy in America, or the vast majority of it, certainly the vanguard, the tip of the spear of the energy that is in opposition to what Israel is doing in Palestine, comes from the exact same people, the exact same segments of society, the same demographics that are deep in the anti-colonialist language and thinking orientation towards Western culture and white supremacy and all of these other things. These things are grouped together. And so if that is allowed to ascend or continue to ascend as it had been up until 2023, if it continued to be allowed to ascend, well, that is going to have spillover effects in the ability for you as an elite to continue to maintain American support for the Greater Israel Project in the Middle East that you were in the past able to allow Israel to do what it felt like it needed to do on the back of accusations of anti-Semitism and that sort of thing. Well, that is now being turned against you because all of that energy against ethnic cleansing, against genocide, against colonialism, against settler states exploiting white settler states exploiting non-white populations, that all of that energy is going to be targeted in destroying the Israel project in the Middle East. And so you want to do whatever you can to combat those forces domestically. And one of the biggest things that you can do is allow people to open up on X, to have elites like Elon Musk support opposition to that set of beliefs that threaten the ability for Israel to continue to operate as it is.
There are, of course, forces in America who are both anti-genocide in Palestine and anti-trans. That would be people like Tucker Carlson. I would argue that's the kind of the new coalition he's attempting to assemble, a more conservative view on sexuality, more traditional view of men and women.
Yes, and while I'm partial to that, I think we both are to a large extent. As we covered a few weeks ago, Tucker Carlson's coalition is quite small. He has massive unfavorability ratings in the U.S. When he went head-to-head with Trump and Trump supporters destroyed him. Carlson wasn't able to do any damage to the Trump coalition, but Trump was able to very much diminish Tucker Carlson's standing among the types of people who Tucker Carlson is trying to court in that coalition. And I would say only half jokingly, if you want to look at a constituency that would be both anti-ethnic cleansing or genocide in Palestine that Israel's carrying out, and also would be supportive of traditional gender norms and certainly opposed to transgenderism of any kind, it would be like the Somalis in Minneapolis or Lewiston, Maine.
Perhaps ironically, a traditional Christian view of chastity would alleviate many of the supposed ills that Me Too is seeking to correct, because a ordered, chaste view of sexuality is pretty restrictive, and when viewed in the modern world, it only allows sex between one married man and his wife. That is the only proper, and the primary purpose of that sex is procreation. So it's a very limited permissibility of sexual activity, and that would address many, if not all, of the issues that Me Too is supposed to address.
But that would be in the culturally ascendant, culturally hegemonic view of that Me Too represents. That would be a cure that would be considered much, much worse than the disease it purports to address. Modern feminism can best be understood as an unrelenting desire to maximize female sexuality and female optionality while maximally restricting male sexuality and male optionality and male ability to control sexual dynamics. Me Too in general, and the Platner case in particular, is a great illustration of exactly that. Racicot, the woman who accused Platner of raping her and was allegedly so scared about what he might do, the damage that he could inflict on her, that she didn't say anything about it for 5 years and just allowed other women to be victims of it, potentially, and even encouraged, or at least was ambiguous about the advice that she offered to other women who were interested in Platner. And so a much more cynical reading of that incident and her relationship more generally with Platner is that she wanted the ability to have sex whenever she wanted it, and that is part of the dynamic of sexual relations, as we alluded to earlier, because men have a stronger sex desire and want sex and will give up commitment for it. That puts women in a position where they can offer sex and have control of men by offering sex. And then at any point in time, they want to rescind that offer, even retroactively, even if it happened yesterday or it happened 5 years ago. If they decided when it happened that they wanted it to happen and they enjoyed it, well, if they in the future decide that they no longer enjoyed it, not just that they won't enjoy it again if it were to come up in the future, but they decide, actually, I didn't enjoy that 5 years ago, well, they have the ability, the power to totally retcon what happened and destroy a man who has effectively no defense, no way to defend himself. They can come back 5 or 10 years later, in the case of Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh, 30, 40 years later, and turn something, or just fabricate it outright, turn it against a man. And in the Me Too era, the mantra that all women must be believed at all times, well, that maximally gives total maximum power for women in sexual dynamics and totally gelds men who have really no reason or no way to defend themselves at all, because it is a he said, she said situation where the parameters culturally are set ahead of time, that in a he said, she said, well, we always believe the she. And so what recourse does the he have at all?
And the women saying this who are, as Ness is describing it, retconning their sexual experience. They might even believe, like Racicot might even believe what she's saying. She might really genuinely believe that she was raped, even when, if you had asked her at the time, she would not have described it that way. People, a lot of times, they tend to think that memories are static, that it's like saving a Word document on a computer. It is essentially saved verbatim, exactly correct, and you save it and then you come back to it a week and it's going to be identical. In reality, human memories do not work like that at all. They are constantly being changed and they are not at all static. So it's not hard for me to believe that if you genuinely put her under a lie detector test, she would pass in describing all of these things, even if those memories are not accurate and that they have changed dramatically in the 5 years.
Yes, in the case of individual actors, I don't mean to ascribe necessarily nefarious motives to them, but incentives are important, and the cultural incentives here that the Me Too framework, that whole scaffolding sets up, is a situation in which women can at any point decide, and just the very anatomical, physical nature of sex is such that the idea of a woman raping a man is just incongruent. It doesn't, nobody will give any credulity to that accusation, because it almost can't happen other than maybe at gunpoint, and even then the physics of it are a little bit questionable. And so the dynamic is such that women are always able to accuse men of untoward wrongdoing in a sexual encounter, but men are never able to do the same with regard to women. And then layered on top of that is the fact that physically a male sex drive is much stronger than a female sex drive is, and you can see the irresistible, enormous power and leverage that this provides women to have over men.
I feel a bit sorry for Graham Platner, I have to say. I think his campaign was interesting. It was impressive the way he was essentially able to come out of nowhere. He does seem like a pretty normal guy and has his heart in the right place, but I have some sympathy for Graham Platner. He sounds like he did what he thought was right as a young man. He enlisted in the military. He was involved in combat operations, put his life on the line for his country, only to learn that he was a tool for what he would describe as the corrupt political establishment and part of the evil empire, and was making the world worse. And he came back and struggled with that and turned to alcohol and struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder and lived a pretty chaotic and disordered life. And it appears that he was able to, or it seemed like he was able to turn that all around, and then to see it come crashing down is kind of sad.
What's also kind of sad is leaving countless men in the lurch, suspending your campaign over accusations you maintain are totally false and, by implication, slanderous, arguably even criminal, on account of Racicot's slander and libel causing real material declines in Platner's quality of life on totally fabricated lies. By allowing that to, on such a national, even international stage, to allow those false accusations to be so successful in derailing what he was about, basically throwing his life off course. By allowing those false accusations to do that, he is condemning countless men in the future to have their own lives wrecked by false accusations.
To cast a little bit more shade on Graham Platner, his working class shtick or facade is not entirely accurate either. His grandfather was a well-known architect, and his father is an attorney and provided the $200,000 mortgage that let Platner buy his home. And he also attended a private high school and also an expensive boarding school in Connecticut. It looks like just today, July 10th, the Maine Secretary of State said Platner had filed the necessary paperwork to withdraw his candidacy. And in his withdrawal notice, Platner said that standard people are desperate for change, and that's why they voted for a new kind of politics by picking him, and that he will continue to fight for the, quote, movement we have built together and the future we believe in, end quote. And then he ended his notice with the following statement: "Fuck ICE, free Palestine, up the hearts." First two are self-explanatory: fuck ICE and free Palestine. Up the hearts, I don't know what that means. A quick Google search indicates it's a Maine-specific reference of some kind.
Well, I promise I was totally unaware of that before Jeff just mentioned it, but man, does it underscore the point I was trying to make previously about how the energy, the anti-colonialist, anti-white supremacy energy that motivates the left domestically when it comes to American politics is the exact same energy that animates them in their opposition to what Israel is doing in the Middle East, doing in Palestine. ICE in this worldview is coded as white supremacist stormtroopers throwing non-whites off the land that they're living in. And of course, Free Palestine is coded as resisting white Israeli stormtroopers throwing Palestinian non-whites off of their land.
Maine is one of the whitest states in the country. Non-Hispanic whites make up about 91% of the population. The registration splits pretty closely even between Democrats and Republicans and unenrolled voters. And so that's partly explains why a Republican like Susan Collins has been able to hold her Senate seat as a Republican in a state that Kamala Harris carried by 7 points in 2024. And so it will certainly be interesting to see what happens in Maine between now and November. First, most immediately, to see how the Democrats in Maine decide to select their replacement for Graham Platner now that he's officially tendered his resignation from the nomination. And then whoever that Democratic nominee is, to see how they address the Platner issue, and then how Susan Collins handles it. And it'll be an interesting one to watch, because if the Democrats don't win Maine in the Senate, it's going to be very difficult for them to regain control of the Senate. Right now, the Republicans hold a 53-47 Senate majority. So Texas, Ohio, and Iowa are also up for grabs in the Senate this year. Talarico versus Ken Paxton is also an interesting one to watch. I think Talarico certainly has a chance. He's the Democrat nominee, a heterosexual white male. One other point I want to make about the Racicot rape allegations. It's weird to juxtapose that with women's obsession with, as Ness was talking about earlier, smut novels like 50 Shades of Grey. Those remain incredibly popular. And I have actually read the original novel, 50 Shades of Grey. And the incident that Racicot describes would not be terribly out of place in a novel like 50 Shades of Grey. And then I was coincidentally reading the novel from the 1940s, Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And there's a scene in there where the protagonist, the hero, Howard Rourke, rapes a female character named Dominique. And again, it's not terribly different than the scene that Racicot was describing. And it's actually kind of weirdly similar, because in the novel, the female character is in her room and she's just kind of sitting there, and then she hears a noise, and Rourke, the protagonist of the novel, comes in through the unlocked window and proceeds to manhandle her, and she resists, and ultimately he overcomes her resistance and penetrates her. And Ayn Rand's characters are not known for ambiguity or necessarily moral complexity. And Howard Rourke is essentially a perfect character, a 100% virtuous man who follows his morals to the T. And actually would never have done anything like Platner did by just betraying his supposed ideals when it became difficult. Howard Rourke would have had to have been killed to have compromised on his values. And so what Howard Rourke did in raping the female character is portrayed unambiguously correct by the female author of the novel, Ayn Rand.
Yes, that's not at all out of place for about 1900 years of Western civilization's understanding of the thing. Up until just the 20th century, there was no real concept of the idea of a husband raping his wife, because the understanding has always been through all of Christian tradition and Western philosophical traditions that in a relationship, part of the duty of the woman in the relationship is to provide sexual access to the man when the man desires it.
I take your point. It doesn't really fit the specifics of the story in The Fountainhead. At this point, I'm still reading the novel now, but at this point, the Howard Rourke and Dominique, they had just met like a few days ago, and they were not in any sort of relationship. Howard Rourke just kind of enters the house uninvited. He certainly had not been invited over there by the female character. But again, nevertheless, it's very clear that Ayn Rand is viewing this as a virtuous action on the part of Howard Rourke.
Well, okay, in that case, yeah, that does deviate deviates more so from traditional Western understanding of these relationships than the Platner case does. Off air, Jeff had described this character as a paramour of Howard Rourke, and I didn't realize that it was incorrect, and I haven't read the book, or I'm not familiar with the characters at all, and so I misinterpreted that, although the broader point still stands that in terms of Western thought, not just Christian, but in particular Christian understanding of sexual dynamics between men and women, in particular between husband and wife, is that there is no way that a man could forcibly put himself on his wife against her will, because that concept wasn't something that even really existed for 1800 plus years of human civilization.
Yes, and I can't speak for every state in the Union, but I think most states it was legally impossible for a man to rape his wife up until, I would guess, maybe the 1950s and 60s. I just did a quick search online, and it appears that actually up until 1976, every U.S. state had this marital exemption, meaning that a husband legally could not rape his wife. And in 1976, Nebraska became the first state to fully criminalize marital rape.
Born out of a wisdom of generations, of centuries, of millennia of human experience, and the problems in jettisoning that idea that rape is impossible in a relationship. Jettisoning that idea is what creates the situations for the Me Too movement to flourish, because when you have sexual relationships, to reiterate what we said at the outset, when you have sexual relationships and the sexual dynamics such as they are, there will forever be the opportunity for a woman in a sexual relationship to retcon a sexual encounter as being rape in the future, and there's no way for the man to protect against that. And so in the case of a marital rape, well, there are going to be countless instances of sexual congress in a marriage. And so if a woman is able to, at some point in the future, determine that one of those instances was in fact not consensual but was rape, well, you can see how this could potentially totally undermine the stability and the fidelity of that marital relationship. And not surprisingly, marriage rates have declined precipitously since what Jeff estimated the end of the exemption on marital rape being in the 1950s or 60s, and it turns out it looks like it's in 1976. Well, whatever decade exactly from that time to the present, we can see a huge decline in the marriage rate and the stability of marriages. And I think more broadly, we can also say that the dynamics of sexual relationships in the West have become much less healthy over that period of time. Before we wrap up, I neglected to mention previously my incredulity of the idea that the reason that the establishment had it out for Platner while they opposed him in the primary and then ultimately dropped their endorsements of him a week before he was going to become the official nominee is not because of his economic populism, but instead is because of that thing that he said about freeing Palestine and his very vocal assertion that what Israel is doing in America is facilitating is a genocide. If we think of people who code themselves or portray themselves as economic populists, a sort of economic populism that goes against the preferred structure of the neoliberal establishment. Somebody like John Fetterman, well, they don't have any real problem with him as long as he is on board with Israel and what it is doing in the Middle East. And though it's a counterfactual, I suspect that if Graham Platner had all of the positions that he does on all of the domestic issues that he holds, but he was supportive of Israel's right to exist, or even just didn't say anything about the Middle East one way or the other, I don't think that he would have experienced this seeming sudden drop of support at exactly the most vulnerable time for him as a political candidate. Racking my brain, I can't think of anyone at all, especially in the Democratic Party, who has ever really suffered for their economic populism. The one name that'll come to mind will be Bernie Sanders, but that really was a unique case in which he was trying to not just have a privileged position in the Democratic Party, but get to the absolute very top, at least of the public-facing side of the Democratic Party, by running for president. But Bernie Sanders has always been quite favorably inclined towards Israel, especially for someone who puts himself forward as a progressive in the Democratic coalition. And so while some of his economic populism might have kept him from being coronated as the presidential candidate for the Democrats, although in 2016 it was more, I don't think anybody could have been able to usurp Hillary Clinton's second run, the first one being snatched away from her by the political upstart Barack Obama, that anyone could have taken that from her in 2016. But the broader point, I'm jesting a little bit there, the broader point I'm trying to make is, to the extent that I've ever seen any politician suffer for that economic populism that they put forward, as long as they are willing ultimately to go along with the program, is in the case of Bernie Sanders, who, instead of being able to potentially become president of the United States, was just allowed to be a very prominent and well-known popular senator for decades at a time, which is hardly a crushing burden to bear. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.